Reading Death 24 Times a Second, Stillness and the Moving Image by Laura Mulvey. Preface. When I first started writing about cinema in the early 1970s, films had always been seen in darkened rooms, projected at 24 or thereabouts frames a second. Only professionals, directors, and editors had easy access to the flatbed editing tables that broke down the speed needed to create the illusion of, quote, natural, end quote, movement. By the end of the 20th century, ways of consuming cinema had multiplied and the regulation of its speed had been widely extended. Then, in the 1970s, I was preoccupied by Hollywood's ability to construct the female star as ultimate spectacle, the emblem and guarantee of its fascination and power. Now, I am more interested in the way that those moments of spectacle were also moments of narrative halt, hinting at the stillness of the single celluloid frame. Then I was concerned with the way Hollywood eroticized the pleasure of looking, inscribing a sanitized voyeurism into its style and narrative conventions. Now, I am more interested in the representations of time that can be discovered in the relation between movement and stillness in cinema. Then, I was absorbed in Hollywood film, turning to that avant-garde as its binary opposite. Now, I think that the aesthetics of cinema have a greater coherence across its historic body in the face of new media technologies and the ways of watching films that they have generated. These contrasts between, quote, then, end quote, and, quote, now, end quote, are not intended to indicate a detachment from the past, but rather to emphasize that my engagement with the cinema of the past has been changed by passing time. In the first chapter of this book, I discuss ways of looking back to the past, but through an altered perspective, informed by the problems and possibilities of the present. My point of departure is an obvious, everyday reality that video and digital media have opened up new ways of seeing old movies. The unexpected encounters that emerge out of this meeting of technologies are familiar to anyone who has experimented with them, from film scholar to film fan. But behind this initial engagement between present and past lies a more rhetorical one. A return to the cinema's past constitutes a gesture towards a truncated history, to those aspects of modernist thought, politics, and aesthetics that seem to end prematurely before their use or relevance could be internalized or exhausted. These histories have been deeply interwoven with the history of cinema. Such a return to the past through cinema is paradoxically facilitated by the kind of spectatorship that has developed with the use of new technologies, with the possibility of returning to and repeating a specific film fragment. Return and repetition necessarily involve interpreting or interrupting the flow of film, delaying its progress, and in the process discovering the cinema's complex relation to time. Needless to say, there is nothing fundamentally new here. To see cinema through delay is to discover a cinema that has always been there, either overtly in the experiments of the avant-garde or more covertly in the great range of fiction film. In this sense, this book is about a changed perspective, the way that my perception of cinema has changed between, quote, then, end quote, and, quote, now, end quote, and the way that within the context of the present, the representation of time has taken new significance. My examples and discussion of, for instance, Stillness are drawn as much from the cinema of the past as they are drawn from new mechanisms of delay. Delayed cinema works on two levels. First of all, it refers to the actual act of slowing down the flow of film. Secondly, it refers to the delay in time during which some detail has lain dormant, as it were, waiting to be noticed. There is a loose parallel here with Freud's concept of deferred action, Nachtraglichkeit, the way the unconscious preserves a specific experience, while its traumatic effect might only be realized by another, later but associated event. Freud developed his thoughts on deferred action out of his analyses of the problem of sexuality in human development. A small child might well not understand the significance of a sexual encounter or witnessed event. Later, however, after the onset of sexual maturity, a similar experience may reactivate the significance of this memory, forgotten and stored in the unconscious. The cinema, like photography, has a privileged relation to time, preserving the moment at which the image is registered, inscribing an unprecedented reality into its representation of the past. This, as it were, storage function may be compared to the memory left in the unconscious by an incident lost to consciousness. Both have the attributes of the indexical sign, the mark of trauma, or the mark of light, and both need to be deciphered retrospectively across delayed time. In common with other film theory today, this book is heavily marked by the image of and the questions raised by the photographic index. While technology never simply determines, it cannot but affect the context in which ideas are formed. Inevitably, the arrival of digital technology has given a new significance to the representation of reality and precipitated a return to the semiotic theory of the index. In the semiotic system elaborated by C.S. Peirce, an icon is a recognizable sign. It refers to the, quote, thing, end quote, it represents through similarity. A symbol is decipherable. A symbol is a decipherable sign. It refers to the, quote, thing, end quote, it represents by means of conventions or codes. An index, however, is a sign produced by the, quote, thing, end quote, it represents. An indexical sign might be recognizable through similarity, as, for instance, in a footprint, and thus have shared qualities with the icon, or it might be decipherable through a code, as, for instance, in the shadow cast by a sundial, and thus have shared qualities with the symbol. But something must leave or have left a mark or trace of its physical presence, whether it persists, as in the thenness of a preserved fingerprint, or not. As in the nowness of a sundial shadow, the quote thing, end quote, inscribes its sign at a specific moment of time. Thus, the index has a privileged relation to time, to the moment and duration of its inscription. It also has a physical relation to the original of which it is the sign, while the photographic image in semiotic terms usually includes the iconic and often includes symbolic aspects of the sign. Its aesthetic specificity is grounded in the index. The photograph cannot generalize, while written, symbolic, or graphic, iconic representations can evoke a class of things. A photographic image is always of one specific and unique, although, of course, endlessly reproducible thing. A return to the index and to the real of the photographic medium is not a return to realism's aspiration to certainty. Rather, the trace of the past in the present is a document or a fact that is preserved in, but also bears witness to the elusive nature of reality and its representations. It is here that the reality of the photograph as index becomes entwined with the problem of time. These semiotic terms recur across this book as I try to reformulate my thoughts on spectatorship through the perspective of time and the varying temporalities inherent in film itself. At certain points in my argument, these questions lead to those associated with modes of address that locate verbal exchange in time and place. These words, called, quote, shifters, end quote, by Roman Jacobson, indicate a speaker's own specific point of utterance in space and time. So, for instance, quote, now, end quote, can refer only to the moment at which it is spoken. Due to this exact reference to an exact position, these words function as, quote, indicators, end quote, and share the indexical signs embedding in time and place. But as part of a symbolic system, language, they are infinitely flexible and transferable so that one person's, quote, here, end quote, becomes another person's, quote, there, end quote. These ideas are central to the chapter, quote, the index and the uncanny, end quote, but are further elaborated in the last 3 chapters of the book in the context of, quote, the possessive spectator, end quote, and, quote, the pensive spectator, end quote. But more generally, the context for the thoughts reflected in this book is located across the space between the shifter words, quote, then, end quote, and, quote, now, end quote, with which I began this preface. As an index, cinema necessarily fixes a real image of reality across time, as I hope to establish in the first 3 chapters of this book. However, the very reality of the index creates uncertainty. First of all, any factual raw material arouses or should arouse a practical sense of uncertainty in terms of its interpretability. The index is a material trace of something, and as it depends for meaning, by and large, on secondary iconic and symbolic signs, it is easily overwhelmed or betrayed. But an amorphous, more intangible difficulty arises out of the presence of preserved time. The cinema combines, perhaps more perfectly than any other medium, two human fascinations, one with the boundary between life and death, and the other with the mechanical animation of the inanimate, particularly the human figure. These porous boundaries introduce the concept of the uncanny and Freud's debate with Jentsch about the power of the old over the new and the hold that irrational belief has over the human mind. The first part of the book discusses these kinds of ways in which reality cannot escape the human unconscious. Necessarily embedded in passing time, these images come to be more redolent of death than of life. These themes recur throughout the book's central section and are discussed in the context of the three central case histories. In the first section of the book, I discuss the pensive and possessive spectator, or in the final section of the book, I discuss the pensive and possessive spectators that emerge from a delayed cinema. The pensive spectator is more engaged with reflection on the visibility of time in the cinema. The possessive spectator is more fetishistically absorbed by the image of the human body. But this differentiation is deceptive and calls Christian Metz's observation that the intellectual spectator cannot be detached from fetishism. In his analysis of the cinema fetish, quote, the person enchanted by what the cinema is capable of, end quote, its technological equipment, Metz points out, block quote, indeed, the equipment is not just physical, equal the fetish proper. It also has its discursive imprints, its extensions into the very text of the film. Here is revealed the specific movement of theory when it shifts from a fascination with technique to the critical study of the different codes that this equipment authorizes. Concern for the signifier in the cinema derives from a fetishism that has taken up its position as far as possible along its cognitive flank. To adapt the formula by which Octave Manoni defines disavowal, equal, quote, I know very well, but all the same, end quote. The study of the signifier is a libidinal position which consists in weakening the, quote, but all the same, end quote, and profiting from this saving of energy to dig deeper into the, quote, I know very well, end quote, which then becomes, quote, I know nothing at all, but I desire to know, end quote. End of block quote. The fetishistic spectator and the libidinal student of the signifier may well be one, but at a certain point, a desire to know comes to the fore. If only to fold back into its previous position, the deferred look may be unexpectedly overwhelmed by images of time that stop individual desires in their tracks as they stumble across the, quote, I know nothing at all, but I desire to know, end quote. Cinema, as it ages, has become more and more the object of, quote, I desire to know, end quote, more obviously in the expansion of cinema and related studies over the last 25 years, but also through the new availability of old cinema through new technology. At the same time, cinema's aesthetic polarities, debated through its critical history, seem to become less important in their differences and more important in their dialectical relations with each other. Rather than diverging into an either or, for instance, specificity of the film strip versus illusion of movement, fiction versus document, grounding in reality versus potential for fantasy, these aspects of the celluloid-based medium move closer together. Passing time, in and of itself, shifts perception of relations and aesthetic patterns, and these shifts are, in turn, accentuated by the new horizons formed by new technologies. As a result, a new kind of ontology may emerge, in which ambivalence, impurity, and uncertainty displace the traditional oppositions. Above all, it is essential to emphasize that these shifts in theory and criticism are the result of a displaced perspective and deferred action. The cinema has always found ways to reflect on its central paradox, the co-presence of movement and stillness, continuity and discontinuity. To look back into the cinema's history, out of passing time and refracted through new technology, is to discover a medium in which these kinds of uncertainties have constantly occurred. In the aesthetic of delay, the cinema's protean nature finds visibility, its capacity to create uncertainty that is, at the same time, certainty because its magic works without recourse to deception or dissimulation. The cinema renders, in Ziga words, quote, uncertainty more certain, end quote. I would like to conclude this preface with a reflection on a well-known section of Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, which has been, throughout the writing of this book, a constant companion and source of visual pleasure for me. The sequence begins as the cameraman films a carriage drawn by a white horse as it canters down a Moscow street, ferrying passengers from the railway station to their home. At a moment when the horse fills the frame, the film freezes into a still, quote, photograph, end quote. The build-up to this moment, the spectator realizes retrospectively, had been geared around movement. The sequence had been prefigured by a shot of a train taken from track level that concentrated the energy of the machine leading into the rapid movement of the carriage, and the horse in particular. This accumulation of movement that carried forward the movement of the film and of time itself, so when the image froze, another temporal dimension suddenly emerged. While movement tends to assert the presence of a continuous, quote, now, end quote, stillness brings a resonance of, quote, then, end quote, to the surface. Here, Vertov manages to switch these registers with a single image. The sequence also leads on to a consideration of the relation and difference between the stilled image and film strip. Despite the fact that Man with the Movie Camera is a documentary, recording the streets of Moscow in 1929, and despite the fact that any filmed image has the same indexical status as the image stilled, the sense of temporality attached to film and to photography differ. This is not simply a matter of movement and stillness, but of the single image as opposed to the film strip, the instant rather than the continuum. The reality recorded by the photograph relates exclusively to its moment of registration. That is, it represents a moment extracted from the continuity of historical time. However historical the moving image might be, it is bound into an order of continuity and pattern, literally unfolding into an aesthetic structure that almost always has a temporal dynamic imposed on it ultimately by editing. The still photograph represents an unattached instant, unequivocally grounded in the indexical relation to the moment of registration. The moving image, on the contrary, cannot escape from duration or from beginnings and ends, or from the patterns that lie between them. The still image of the horse suggests a photograph. It asserts the moment at which that one frame was recorded, even as it is duplicated to create a freeze effect. But the sequence continues and explores the single frame's place in the sequence rather than in isolation. Vertov takes this exposition further. The sequence moves to other freeze frames. The surrounding streets, faces of women and children from this and other sequences, and then introduces the celluloid strip itself. When the image of a child is shown repeated in the individual frames of a fragment of film, the sequence seems to touch the point between the aesthetic of the photography and the cinema. In their stillness, the repeated images belong to the photograph, to the moment of register, but in their sequence, they signify poignantly the invisibility of these individual moments from a larger whole, an integral part of the shift into movement. They represent the individual moments of register, the underpinning of film's indexicality. In Jean-Luc Godard's film of 1960, La Petite Soledad, or Soldat, the answer to the question, quote, what is cinema, question mark, end quote, is, quote, truth 24 times a second, end quote. But these frames, as individual photographs, are also a testament to cinema's uncanny. So the answer to the question, quote, what is cinema, question mark, end quote, should also be, quote, death 24 times a second, end quote. The photograph's freezing of reality, truth in Godard's definition, marks a transition from the animate to the inanimate, from life to death. The cinema reverses the process by means of an illusion that animates the inanimate frames of its origin. The shots of film strips lead into the editing room where Elizaveta Silova is working on Man with a Movie Camera. She holds the inert film strip in her hands. She winds it on the editing table. she cuts out certain frames. The inanimate frames come back to life. People from very different sections of the movie look, react, tellingly, including the faces of children who will be found much later watching a magic show. Finally, the continuum of the film is reestablished with its own temporal logic, in which the question of time constantly occurs, but within its own unfolding structure. In this sequence, the editor's work personifies the reordering and transforming of raw material as she sets the film strip back into motion on the editing table with the moving image gradually or as she sets the film strip back into motion on the editing table, the moving image gradually reintegrates the sequence back into the course of the film. But the spectator is brought back with a heightened consciousness of the blending of two kinds of time. Vertov concentrates concisely and elegantly into a few minutes many of the ideas that I have tried to articulate in this book. This reflection on two kinds of time explores the relations between movement and stillness in the cinema long before new technology made them easily accessible. Both Vertov's delay cinema is, or but Vertov's delayed cinema is a reminder across time, across the decades of the 20th century, of the aesthetic and political relation between film and modernity. With a repetition of deferred action, the return to the cinema of the 1920s that was so influential in the quote then end quote of the 1960s and 70s has perhaps even more relevance in the present climate of political and aesthetic dilemma. And I was reading the preface to Death 24 Times a Second, Stillness, and the Moving Image by Laura Mulvey.